one of my daughters and her husband have 4 children, ages 6 and down, and they bought a house with a swimming pool, which is great when you have little children, but there was a problem. The pool fence was pretty much roached beyond repair. The gate had to be held closed with a bungee cord. There were rusted out gaps where a kid could just go through, and so they knew they needed to replace it. And family always seems to be voluntary help. Have you ever noticed that? So I was volunteered to go and assist putting in the new fence. Now, he and I could have gotten the thing in. It wouldn't have been straight. It would probably been leaning, maybe been even worse than the one that was there. We probably could have gotten it in. But it was really awesome because his actual personal mentor from when he was a teenager now lives out here in Arizona and came down and helped us. And he is retired from, guess what? Fencing. He owned a fence company. Amen. So when it came to putting it in, it was done exactly right. Not because of his father-in-law's great ability and wisdom, but because we had somebody who knew what they were doing there. And he told us what to do, and that's what we did. The exact same thing happens everywhere in life. And sometimes we think I got this. I got this may be about the most foolish thing any person could say. We need an expert to help us to live life correctly, and that expert is God. Yes. And when we exclude him, we end up with a fence that's leaning not well. And so if you'll turn to 1 Kings chapter 20, we're going to look at some principles of doing things God's way, doing them the right way. So 1 Kings chapter 20. And we start right off with one of the difficulties of the Old Testament. There are a few things that make the Old Testament a challenge for people. One of them we find right here, and that is we got a lot of people and a lot of places, most of which we know nothing about. So 1 Kings 20 starts off, Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his army together. 32 kings are with him, and horses and chariots, and he went up and closed in on Samaria and fought against it. And he sent messengers into the city to Ahab, king of Israel, and said to him, Thus says Ben-Hadad, your silver and your gold are mine, your best wives and children also are mine. And the king of Israel answered, As you say, my lord, O king, I'm yours, and all that I have. The messengers came again and said, Thus says Ben-Hadad, I sent you, saying, Deliver to me your silver and your gold, your wives and your children. Nevertheless, I will send my servants to you tomorrow about this time, and they will search your house and the houses of your servants, and lay hands on whatever pleases you, and take it away. Then the king of Israel called all the elders of the land and said, Mark now and see how this man is seeking trouble. For he sent to me for my wives and my children, for my silver and my gold, and I did not refuse him. And all the elders and all the people said to him, Do not listen or consent. So he said to the messengers of Ben-Hadad, Tell my lord the king, all that you first demanded of your servant I will do, but this thing I cannot do. And the messengers departed and brought him word again. Ben-Hadad sent to him and said, The gods do so to me and more also, if the dust of Samaria shall suffice for handfuls for all the people who follow me. And the king of Israel answered, Tell him, let not him who straps on his armor boast himself as he who takes it off. When Ben-Hadad heard this message, as he was drinking with the kings in the booths, he said to his men, Take your positions, and they took their positions against the city. So what is all of this? Well, let's start with a little bit of geography. So we have a map. This shows where the battle lines are and kind of where everything happens. But this is Samaria right here. This is where it's all going to happen. And the nation of Syria is up here. Damascus was the capital. And so they've come down, crossed over the Jordan River, and come down now to the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And so it's this big green blob here. That's 10 tribes. There are also 2 tribes, bless you, 2 tribes that are here, and that's the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. So this is only against north, so they come against Samaria, which is the capital city. Now that part, not too difficult. Then we get this dude, Ben-Hadad. His name means my dad's Hadad. He's the king of Syria, and then Ahab is the king of Israel. But who in the world are these other 32 kings? In the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, there are only a few thousand words that are used. And many of those words do multiple duty. And so, by the way, we have the same thing. Yes. If I was to tell you your life depends on giving me a correct definition of the word tooth, half of you would survive and half of you would die. Because some of you say it was this, but others say, no, it's the thing on a saw blade. And yet others of you say, no, it's the thing on a wheel. Like we use the word tooth for a variety of different things. If you nod, that means you understand. If not, I got to give example after example after example till you go, yes, I got it. So everybody see how that works? Okay, so the word king is one of those words in the Old Testament. When we think of king, we think of like the top dude over everything. But they actually use the word king for that person, but also for anybody, oftentimes it's in charge. So there's no word for mayor in the Bible. So probably these 32 are in charge of a city or an area. And so each of them is commissioned to bring soldiers from the area under their charge. So we have 32 of them, and so they've all gathered together, and they come with their weapons, their horses and their chariots, and they close in on Samaria, and they fight against it. Now we're going to see a little bit how they fight against it. So he sends messengers into the city, and notice what he says in verse 3. He says, listen what I want. I want all your money, I want your wives and your children. And how does Ahab respond? Verse 4, the king of Israel answered, as you say, my lord, O king, I am yours and all that I have. In other words, you can have them. You can have them. Now, this is the first principle of doing things God's way. Do not make decisions out of fear of others. He's afraid of the king of Syria. He's afraid of what their armies will do. And so it stuns me that he would say, I want to save my own skin, so take my wife and kids. Personally, I find that to be a pathetic husband and a terrible father. Yes. And so out of fear, he said, well, you can have them. So Ben-Hadad says, well, if he's that much of a pushover, let me see if I can get more out of him. He says, okay, wait, I'm going to send my soldiers in. They're going to take whatever they want. They'll pick the wives and children and all the silver and gold. And finally, King says, that's enough. Even the most cowardly, scared, petrified person can eventually be backed far enough into a corner that they say enough. And so even Ahab, who is acting out of fear, now Ben-Hadad's basically crossed the line. It's too much to ask for. And so he calls the elders and says, what do y'all think I ought to do? And they're in agreement. Don't let them do any of this. And so Ben-Hadad, I love verse 10 11 are great. This is what Ben-Hadad says. Look, I'm going to make Samaria like just dust. I mean, nothing left. And I love verse 11. Let not him who straps on the armor boast himself as he who takes it off. In other words, you can brag before, but that's not nearly as good as bragging afterwards. So you can talk smack all you want to, but the person that can really talk smack is the one who won. And so he says, don't boast when you're putting on the armor, boast when you take it off. We had a victory. And so he kind of throws back. And y'all know that fights usually start this way. I mean, I know there are some oddballs that just want to walk up and start punching somebody. For the most part, most fights start with this. Most wars start with this. And, negotiations have failed. What does that mean? That means they started bad-mouthing each other. And so there's a lot of posturing going. So the world's been like this like forever. And so verse 12 shows us what they do. This is how they conducted warfare in the ancient world. The king gets drunk in his tent, and the soldiers go out and fight. So he's drinking in his booth, and that's mentioned because it's going to come up again. Now when he says take your positions, they take their positions against the city. The way warfare was conducted until Alexander of Macedon, who changed the world. That's why he was called Alexander the Great. The way you defeated a city was you surrounded it and you starved the people out. It was not unusual for one of these sieges to go for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So basically, they surround the city so that no one can get out and nothing can get in. So no food can get into the city. No water can get in the city except what would fall by the rain. And so you would basically starve the people out. And the accounts from history about this are just horrific. People would eat their children. They would eat, just the dung from animals, anything that, when you're starving, it is amazing the lengths that people will go to. And so that's what That's what they're going to do. They're going to, what they do, they surround the city so they can take it. So if we're going to do things God's way, we have to do what's right and not wilt out of fear of others. There was a nurse, it was her first day in a large hospital, and she was working in surgery. At the end of the surgery, she said to the doctor, "You only removed 11 sponges, and we used 12. The doctor said, "Nope, I'll remove them all. We'll close the incision now." She said, "No, doctor, you used 12 sponges." The doctor said, "I take full responsibility. Suture, we're going to sew up." And she said, "No, you cannot do that. You used 12 sponges and you only removed 11. At that point, the doctor smiled, picked up his foot, and there was the 12th sponge. He looked at her and he said, "You will make a good nurse." First day on the job, what would most people do? Out of fear, they would not say anything. But she did what was right. To do things God's way, we cannot respond. Now notice very carefully, I have not said that we don't need to be, we're going to be afraid, but we cannot respond out of that fear and allow it to dominate and control us like Ahab does. And puts the lives of his wives and children, the wives and children of the people in the city, in danger because of that fear. The second thing about doing things God's way is we have to trust Him. Verse 13, "And behold, a prophet came near to Ahab, king of Israel, and said, Thus says the Lord, have you seen all this great multitude? Behold, I will give it into your hand this day, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And Ahab said, By whom? He said, Thus says the Lord, by the servants of the governors of the districts. Then he said, Who shall begin the battle? He answered, You. Then he mustered the servants of the governors of the districts, and they were 232. And after them he mustered all the people of Israel, 7,000. And they went out at noon while Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk in the booths." There seems to be a recurring theme here with this guy. "He and the 32 kings who helped him. The servants of the governors of the districts went out first, and Ben-Hadad sent out scouts, and they reported to him, Men are coming out from Samaria. He said, If they've come out for peace, take them alive, or if they've come out for war, take them alive. So these went out of the city, the servants of the governors of the districts, and the army that followed them. And each struck down his man. The Syrians fled, and Israel pursued them. But Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, escaped on a horse with horsemen. And the king of Israel went out and struck the horses and chariots, and struck the Syrians with a great blow. Then the prophet came near to the king of Israel and said to him, Come, strengthen yourself, and consider well what you have to do. For in the spring the king of Syria will come up against you. And the servants of the king of Syria said to him, Their gods are the gods of the hills, and so they were stronger than we. But let us fight against them in the plains, and surely we shall be stronger than they are." Now, who is going to give the victory? He says, gather the governors. These are just basically local kind of people in charge. Get them and all their people. 232 is not what I would call an army. If I be honest with you, 7,000 isn't much of an army. But look how God in His wisdom says, if you want to do it my way, trust me when I tell you this is what you need to do. Go out at noon. Now, noon is not a normal time to try to, if you're going to get out of the city that's being besieged, when's the best time to go? At 12, midnight. Not in the middle of the day when you can be seen. You want to slip out under cover of darkness. And so the middle of the day, the brightest part of the day is not the most obvious time. But God says, I want you to go out in the most obvious time. And here's how I want you to do it. I want you to send the servant. Now, why would you send out the servants first? Well, let's think this through. So a city is being besieged. We're going to starve them out. So what's one of the ways to lengthen your life in the city? It is to remove the people that are unnecessary for the functioning of the city. So what do? You take the servants and you go, look, y'all can leave. That way you don't have to feed them. So you have fewer mouths to feed. Now, typically, a foreign army is not interested in the servants unless they want to take them as their own servants. Yeah. So it just kind of makes, let's remove them first. So when Ben-Hadad sees the servants coming out, he just assumes, oh, they're letting the people go that they're not necessary for the city, and so that they'll have fewer mouths to feed. And so that's why he said, take them alive. Maybe they'll be servants for us. And when they show up, they discover they're actually warriors. And so they strike them. And so God says, here's when I want you to do it, and here's how I want you to do it. And then he says, be sure to prepare for the future because they are coming again next year. So God doesn't just say, here's how we're going to do it now, but you need to kind of plan and prepare for the future. So here's what I want you to see. I find this, it's really interesting. If you have electrical problems at your house, who do you call? All right. If you have a problem with your car, who do you call? Mechanic. Very good. Let's see, we go 3 for 3. If you have problems with plumbing, who do you call? That's right. But no, you don't. You don't just randomly call somebody. You look at their Google reviews, their Yelp reviews. You don't just call any electrician. You don't just call anybody who calls themselves a plumber. You want someone who has the skills, but you also want someone you can trust. Yes. That they're not going to charge you for work they don't do, or tell you that need work that you don't need done, that they're going to try to take advantage of you. So you don't want just someone who has skill. You also want someone that you can trust. In other words, character is just as important as ability. In fact, maybe even more important. So when it comes to trusting God, it's not just that God knows what to do. We trust Him because of His skill and ability. But we trust God because of His character. And so what's going on here when the prophet says you need to trust God, he's not just saying trust God because He knows what to do. He's saying trust God because of His character. He is not going to betray you, or misuse you, or mistreat you. So you and I can trust God not just because of His wisdom and His skill and His ability and His power, but we trust God because of His honesty and His faithfulness and His consistency. We trust Him because of His character. And so that's why the prophet here calls him to do that. So in verse 23, they make a declaration about their deity, that He is the God of the hills. Israel's God's the God of the hills, and theirs is the God of the plain. So that's what we want to fight. So verse 24, this is the advice we want to give you. Remove the kings, each from his post. In other words, fire the guys who have been in charge, because clearly they're failures. So remove them, the kings, each from his post, and put commanders in their places. In other words, don't get the guys who are the political leaders to lead you in a battle. Get the soldiers to lead you in a battle.
That's smart.
That's a pretty good idea. Verse 25, muster an army like the army that you have lost, horse for horse, chariot for chariot. So rearm yourself. Then we will fight against them in the plain, and surely we will be stronger than they. And he listened to their voice, and he did so. So in the spring, verse 26, Ben-Hadad mustered the Syrians, went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. The people of Israel mustered and were provisioned and went against them. The people of Israel encamped before them like 2 little flocks of goats, but the Syrians filled the country. That's a really cool description of they were outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned. So who should win? Okay, they're outnumbered, outmanned, and outgunned. Who should win? The Syrians. That had been Ben-Hadad's army. That just kind of makes sense. But verse 28, a man of God came near and said to the king of Israel, thus says the Lord, because the Syrians have said, the Lord is a God of the hills, but He is not a God of the valleys. Therefore I will give all this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And they encamped opposite one another 7 days. Then on the 7th day the battle was joined. And the people of Israel struck down the Syrians 100,000 foot soldiers in 1 day. And the rest fled into the city of Aphek. And the wall fell upon 27,000 men who were left. Ben-Hadad also fled and entered an inner chamber in the city. And his servants said to him, behold, now we have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. Let us put sackcloth around our waists and ropes on our heads and go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare your life. So they tied sackcloth around their waist and put ropes on their heads and went to the king of Israel and said, your servant Ben-Hadad says, please let me live. And he says, does he still live? He is my brother. Now the men were watching for a sign, and they quickly took it up from him and said, yes, your brother Ben-Hadad. Then he said, go and bring him. Then Ben-Hadad came out to him, and he caused him to come up into the chariot. And Ben-Hadad said to him, the cities that my father took from your father I will restore, and you may establish bazaars for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. And Ahab said, I will let you go on these terms. So he made a covenant with him and let him go. Now, what's this whole God of the hills and God of the valleys thing? Well, in the ancient world, they believed that gods were territorial. If you've ever read the account of Naaman, who comes down and is healed of leprosy, he says, hey, can I take 2 carts of dirt back so I can worship the God of Israel? Like, you had to be on God's dirt to worship Him. When David fled, he said, you've made me go and serve foreign gods, because he was no longer on the dirt of Israel. And so they said, well, Israel's God, his dirt's the hills. But if we can get him on our turf, on our God's, like the plain, then that's where we'll fight. And so God says, I don't think so. Let's show them that I'm the God of everything. So God said, I'm going to give you a victory. And notice the victory is so that they would know that He is the God of everything, and so that Ahab would know that He is the one true God. And so God says, I am doing this as a declaration of who I am, and so that you will know who I am. So if we're going to follow God, we need to know who He is. He is not just the God of the hills, He's also the God of the valleys. And by the way, He's the God of everything in between and everything over and under and all the rest of it. And so we need to know who He is. We need to know the God that we are serving. And we also need to consult Him before we make major decisions. A mouthpiece, a spokesperson for God shows up. A prophet shows up and says, this is what God says. Before you do anything, this is the word from the Lord. You and I need to consult God. And we need to know the God that we are consulting. Why do the servants say to Ben-Hadad, the kings of Israel are merciful kings? Because a king was supposed to reflect the deity that he served. And if you serve a merciful God, then you should be what kind of king? A merciful king. And so they say, we've heard they're merciful, so let's wave the white flag. That's the sackcloth and the ropes on the head. Let's wave the white flag, and maybe He will spare your life. So this is what they do, and Ahab spares his life, and Ben-Hadad. Now, what is all this about? I'll give back some cities. That makes sense. But one in the world is establishing a bazaar in Damascus. Well, the Syrians had different dietary laws than the Jews, than the Israelites. And so what he's saying is, we'll set up, for lack of better description, use modern term, we'll set up kosher stores in our hometown, just like your dad set up stores for Syrians to buy their kind of food. Does that make sense? And so if you're living there, and it's really, I find it fascinating when people go overseas, but they still want American food. Like, our goal when we're overseas is only eat the local food. We've had to violate that a time or two. In Jerusalem, on the Sabbath, it was our anniversary. The only place that was open was McDonald's. It was the least romantic, but maybe the most memorable anniversary meal we've ever shared. So sometimes you're not left with much choice, but our preference is always to eat the local food, to experience it. But it is interesting how when people move, they look for, is there any place that's got food like back home? So that's what the bazaars are. Can we get some food like back home? And so he says, I'll allow them to set up these kind of places. Now all this sounds okay, but there's a problem here. The problem is they were commanded numerous times, beginning in the book of Deuteronomy, going through Joshua and Judges, not to enter into treaties with foreign nations. They were not to do that. There was to be a clear distinction between the people of Israel and others. And this is, in the Old Testament, the concept of holiness. In other words, you're either devoted to the Lord or you're devoted to everything else. And to be for one is to be against the other. And because Ben-Hadad is a servant of a foreign deity, there was to be no covenant with him, because he rejected all the things of God and served things of the world. So I'm going to see if I can kind of illustrate this for us a little bit. If I could get about half a dozen volunteers just to come up here on the stage, and we'll wait. Okay, now how many is that? No, you should have a weapon, but no, you don't have to have one. Okay, so we said half a dozen. There we go, all right. Somebody can count to 6, excellent. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide the stage right where the cross is. So I need 3 over here, and I need 3 over here. Okay, so looking for your perspective, these are on the right hand and these are on the left. So this is, on this side, Israel, Ahab, committed to things of God. Because y'all are on the side of righteousness and holiness, you're opposed to everything over there and to anybody that serves anything over there. Now, because y'all are on the side of unrighteousness, I could not have just done this any better on my own. Because you're on the side of unrighteousness, you hate all the things of God. This is why Jesus says you'll be hated by all men for my name's sake. Because we are over here. And we hate the things of God. We hate the truth. We don't want to do it God's way. We want to do it our way or some other way or serve some deity of our own. And so they are exclusive to one another. So what Ahab should have done was execute Ben-Hadad, because of a commitment to a foreign deity, so that they would not be diluted. Now here's the great news in the Bible. All of us start here. But because of the mercy and the grace of God, we can move from this side to that side. Even you can be saved. You know, this is, by the way, the message of the Bible. We are born in sin, opposed to the things of God. But by the grace of God through His Son, Jesus Christ, we can be transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. We can be transferred from children of our father Satan to children of our Father, the God who sits in heaven. We can be transferred from guilty to delivered, to declared righteous, unrighteous to righteous, unholy to unholy, to holy. This is the message of the Bible. You do not have to stay over here. But when you are over here, you hate everything over here. And when you're over here, you hate everything over here. That's why Jesus says that we are to hate the things of this world. We're in the world, but not of it. So he is not to make a truce with Ben-Hadad, because there's not supposed to be a blending of these two sides. Okay? He is not doing it God's way. Thanks, y'all did a great job. Appreciate it. And so this is what he should have done. Now, to show you that's what he should have done, look at verse 35. A certain man, the sons of the prophet, said to his fellow at the command of the Lord, "Strike me, please." But the man refused to strike him. Then he said to him, "Because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, behold, as soon as you have gone from me, a lion will strike you down." And as soon as he departed from him, a lion met him and struck him down. Then he found another man and said, "Strike me, please." And the man struck him and wounded him. So the prophet departed and waited for the king by the way, disguising himself with a bandage over his eyes. And as the king passed, he cried to the king and said, "Your servant went out into the midst of the battle, and behold, a soldier turned and brought a man to me and said, 'Guard this man. If by any means he is missing, your life shall be for his life, or else you will pay a talent of silver,'" which is 70 pounds, and no regular soldier would have that much money. So verse 40, "As your servant was busy here and there, he was gone. And the king said to him, 'So shall your judgment be. You have yourself have decided it,'" which in their world would have meant he would be executed for failure to do his duty. So verse 41, he hurried to take the bandage away from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. And he said to him, "Thus says the Lord, because you have let go out of your hand the man whom I had devoted to destruction. Therefore your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people." And the king of Israel went to his house, vexed and sullen, and came to Samaria. Now it's interesting that he uses this drama, because the reality is sometimes when we dramatize things, it makes a bigger impact. Just saying it sometimes doesn't make as big an impact as the YouTube video. Yep. There is something about it. And so he does this drama to kind of indicate, sort of what he had done. It's interesting. He says, "Ahab, you have made this declaration against yourself. You have made this sentence against yourself. You said there's a penalty, and I'm telling you there should be a penalty for what you have done." So he was told, he knew what he should have done, but he didn't do it. So it says, now here is the punishment for it, because you did not obey God. You did not obey Him. Now, I want you to see what we have right here with Ahab, because it's very instructive for us. There is a tendency that we have to flatten people, to not view them as like in 3D or complete or complex, but to flatten them and make them like just one thing. Just one kind of thing about them, as though that's all they are. They're an angry person, as though they just live angry all the time. Or, they're an introvert, as though they never enjoy being around anybody. We're not like that. We're more complex than that. Far more complex than that. There's more to us than just one thing. Let me see if I can illustrate it and then show you what Ahab's done, and to try to help us pull all this together about doing it God's way. This is a Christmas coloring book. And I was looking at it a couple weeks ago, and I got to thinking, if I ask you what is Christmas and you could only give one answer, what would you say? Now in church we'd say, Jesus is the reason for the season. I know we're supposed to say it at church, but really, if I say what is Christmas, You may get a thought, but then you get other thoughts. It's decorating the tree. Some of you have a family tradition, and that's what comes to mind, whatever it is that you do, that's your family tradition. We like to go watch all the last-minute shoppers and laugh at them. And so, or it's the Christmas Eve service, or it's the family getting together, or the praise. There's a lot. In other words, Christmas is not just one thing. Yes. And you might say, well, it's the manger. Yeah, but it's also the shepherds. And it's Mary, and it's Joseph, and it's angels. In other words, even the biblical account is not just one thing. If you make Christmas just one thing, you misunderstand Christmas and you miss out on how broad and vast and encompassing it is. We do the exact same thing with God. What has Ahab done? Ahab has reduced God to a God who delivers. But that's it. In other words, him doing it God's way works as long as it involves deliverance. But Ahab doesn't see God as more than that, as a God who gives instructions on how to be a king, how to relate to other kings, who you can and cannot enter into covenant with. In other words, for us, we have to be very, very careful that we do not reduce God to the God who saves us from our sins, and that's sort of all he does. We don't serve a flat, one-dimensional God. We serve an all-encompassing God who has a variety of characteristics and traits. And so, yes, God is merciful, but he's also a God of holiness and justice and righteousness. And a lot of, we need to be very, very, it concerns me when I hear people say this. Well, you know, God is a God of love. Like that's the only dimension of God that exists. That is not true. God is more than just a God of love. When you say that, here's what you've said. He's a God of the hills, but not the valleys. We've reduced him to just one element. And that element may be true. The manger is true when we think about Christmas. Yes. It's the little thing we put the baby Jesus in. Okay. The angels are true when we think of Christmas. Yes. The virgin birth is true when we think of Christmas. All of those, but Christmas is not just one of those things. And God is not just one thing. God is multifaceted. And so if we're going to do things God's way, we have to recognize that God's way applies to every area of life, not just like my spiritual life, this dimension, but all the rest of my life is mine. It's not like that. He wants you to do it his way in every area of life. Yes. All of them. Be careful not to reduce God to one slice of your life, as though everything else is yours. He is the God of all of it. And here's the really cool thing. Because of his character, we can trust him with every area of our life. Let me finish out by reminding us that God's way is sometimes difficult to understand. I can explain to you all of the theological ramifications and give you all of the really big words that I learned in seminary about the death of Jesus Christ. But the reality is, it doesn't make sense that the most powerful being that ever was or ever will be would sacrifice his own son for rebellious creatures like us. But that's exactly what he did. God did not do it the way you would expect. But we trust God when he says that the death of Jesus Christ and his resurrection on Sunday morning is the only way that we can have everlasting life, the only way that we can be right with God. We have to trust the character of God, that when he says, this is the way you come into my presence and will be with me forever, we must trust his character that this is right. Yes. And it is true. But we don't just get forgiven God's way. I want to remind us, we are to live every day God's way. And sometimes God says, I want you to head out at noon when you think, no, midnight is better and safer. God says, you may not understand it, but my way is always the best. Trust me and follow me.